Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jeff Bruner from WiLS. WiLSWorld Shorts is a series of webinars designed to bring you relevant and timely information kind of directly to your desk. So today's session is tips and tricks, web accessibility tips and tricks with Ashley Zick. Ashley Zick is a user experience consultant and an adjunct professor at Milwaukee School of Engineering. For the past 10 years, she's been dedicated to building inclusive and immersive experiences across desktop, mobile, and emerging platforms. Her areas of specialty include accessibility, data visualization, and building data-informed research strategies for design teams of all sizes. She's also been enamored with libraries and public outreach since a small child, and she's thrilled to be here today. So in today's world, and perhaps right now more than ever, libraries are far more than a physical place. The online resources that your institutions provide are just as important, and it's critical that they be able to serve all patrons. Ashley's going to talk to us about some best practices, tools, and resources to help make sure that your online presence is accessible to all. So Ashley will be presenting and sharing some slides with us. Feel free to put any questions that you may have into the chat box, but we'll probably hold off on addressing them until the very end of the session. And with that, I will turn things over to you, Ashley.
Thanks, Jeff. Maybe figure out how to go to the next slide. Okay. Sorry, technical difficulty. Please hold. We'll go this way. Can you still see my screen okay?
No, we are not seeing your screen, Ashley.
Yeah, Zoom wouldn't let me progress, so I have to try this one more time.
It can be a little weird where the focus is. You know what I mean?
Oh, sure. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
We are.
Perfect. All right, sorry about that. So yeah, as Jeff mentioned, accessibility is really important for institutions. I think there's a lot of large organizations who have really started focusing on it, but there's a lot of other areas of progress that we can definitely make. I really like this quote from Microsoft, and I think it'll set a good expectation for the talk. The idea is that accessibility shouldn't necessarily be an add-on. It shouldn't be just because of legal reasons, although we'll touch on that a little bit. Ultimately, by creating something that's accessible, you're making it inclusive. You're making it, your entire audience have a better experience. And ultimately, you're striving to create something that really builds up a better experience, a better life for the people around you. So I want to quickly talk about the accessibility. We won't spend a ton of time here because, I'm assuming by joining this talk that you have already got some of them down. And then we'll spend the bulk of the time really focused on some ways that you can start to implement accessibility today. So there's three big benefits to accessibility I want to talk about. So the first one we'll get through right away. It's kind of the pink elephant in the room, is that there's lawsuits. I mean, lawsuits are very expensive. And it's one of several reasons that people choose to become accessibility compliant. But really these second two are the ones that I want to spend some time on today, and that's improving that experience for everybody. Becoming an accessibility compliant organization doesn't necessarily just improve your organization for impaired individuals. It improves your experience for everyone. So a little bit of background here, and this is actually from the ALA website. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act is a legal compliance for websites that are federally funded. So if your library is federally funded or a government organization, such as a city library, then that would be what you fall under. If you're a private library, such as a university library, what you would fall under is the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the standards between the two are exactly the same. We're just going to treat them sort of as the same, but just as an FYI here. Unfortunately, accessibility lawsuits are increasing pretty heavily. So if we look here, there's a pretty big increase, and that's when looking at budgeting and trying to determine if it makes sense to really spend your money on accessibility in 2020. I would encourage you to repurpose some of these slides. Again, it's really important to build that inclusive community, but sometimes, those dollars are what wins projects. Not going to go through all of these, but there's a ton of industries, government, of course, financial, everybody from Disney to Beyonce to the NBA to a lot of local restaurants have all been sued for a lack of accessibility. They're also super expensive. So in addition to any sort of legal costs, you can't really focus on things that you might want to do with your website because you have to sort of focus just on the accessibility. And unfortunately, there's some diminished reputation there too. You don't want to necessarily be the institution that got sued for not being accessible. Getting to some of the, I guess, more holistic benefits of accessibility. We think about official, legally recognized permanent disability standpoint, 1 in 5 people in the United States have some sort of legal disability. And that includes things like, I'm missing a limb, so holding a phone may be hard. Or, from Alzheimer's, so remembering might be hard. Blindness, vision loss, deafness. These are all the traditional things we think about when we think about designing for accessibility. But I want to challenge you to think beyond that. So that small amount of area, 1 in 5, that might not be enough, but if you start to expand past that, really everyone can have a temporary impairment at any time. So you might not have a missing limb, but you could have broken your hand, you could have carpal tunnel syndrome, you could be doing something else and just have some sort of injury. Eye surgeries are pretty common, maybe it's an ear infection, whatever it is. But the idea is that when you're designing for a permanent impairment, you also kind of by default design for all these temporary impairments as well. But I want to go one step further. So the idea is that situations, just being kind of aware of what is happening with the user at any one time, expands that even more. So picking on folding a phone and tapping. You might not be missing a limb, you might not have broken an arm, but let's say you're holding a bag, you're holding a child, you're holding something else. It doesn't really matter that you still have that arm, you can't use it. You're not going to put the baby down so you can surf the web a little bit faster. You're going to try and figure out how to use the phone with one hand. And situations can impact your entire audience. So when we design for that smaller set of legal disabilities, we get all of this sort of built in. Another way to look at it, 2.4% of Americans permanently lose their sight every year. Maybe that's enough for you to care about designing a screen reader enabled website, maybe not. There's about 5% of people who have some sort of eye surgery or other thing that happens that they temporarily lose sight. We expand that, we have people who are looking at their phone or there's a glare or they're distracted by something. That loss of sight gets up to 100% because again, we're kind of looking at this from a situational perspective. So again, designing for accessibility, you kind of design for that entire audience, not just that 2.4%. And the last sort of benefit I want to more so than just your average population, web accessibility really enables disabled patrons to access your entire library. I mean, an example, a paraplegic man can't necessarily drive himself to the library. He could rely on others to help him get books and then everything else. Or if there's a website that's accessible and it works well with the technology that he can use, he can now go online and get an audiobook and have it play for him. It gives him a really big sense of independence that that individual might not have otherwise had. It also offers a place where individuals can start to connect with others. We're promoting literacy for all individuals. And every benefit of a library still applies to those impaired individuals, but they might not be able to get some of those benefits actually in person. And so by designing for our web accessibility, we can really make sure that all of the great library benefits apply to everyone. So there's one particular group who makes standards. They sort of fell into it by accident, but when they started designing back in 1995, they didn't really envision it would become law. And then, fast forward to about 2010, their first set of standards actually became law in the United States with ADA Title III. So they have 4 sort of standards that I'm going to talk about, that something has to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. I'm going to give a couple different examples for each of these, but this webinar will by no means cover everything you need to do in accessibility. Instead, I want to spend the next, 30 minutes, 20 minutes or so going through some tips that every single person on this call can leave and start doing immediately. So the first of these 4 standards is perceivable. The idea is that it has to be presented in a way to users that they can actually perceive. So what does that mean? Well, they have to be able to use one of their senses to be able to perceive something. So if you're on this call right now, I'm talking to you, that you can perceive it, it's audio. Or if you're reading the slides, that would be visual. There's a lot of different, various other senses, but audio and visual tend to be the ones that we use most commonly for websites. We haven't invented smell-o-vision yet, so that's not really a commonly used web accessibility. So here's the 3 things I want to talk about, and we'll go through each of them, step by step. So the first one is called an alt tag or an alternate tag, or alt tag. So when you're looking at a website, you can obviously see all the pictures, you can see all the text, you know what's there. But if you are designing and you don't include an alternate tag, that visually impaired user is not going to know what's in that image. They might not even know the image is there unless you code your website in a certain way. So when a screen reader is kind of looking through all of this, what happens is it'll come across this picture of apples and it'll describe it as an image, but that's it. So if it's important information in that picture, you need to describe it, so then that way they can sort of envision it as well. When you're thinking about how to write a good alt tag, think about how you would describe that image to a friend. So in this case, I might say an illustration of 4 shiny apples. If I had different, if it was actually a picture of apples, maybe I would just say 4 shiny red apples. So then the screen reader, because you added that tag, will actually know what's in it, and it will actually voice that to the user. This has to be done with pretty much every non-text element on your page. So it'll be able to read all the headers, all the text, and all the content automatically, but things like buttons, images, any video, all of that will need some sort of non-visual alternative. So buttons are a little interesting because it'll automatically know it's a button by default. And this button here says submit form. So the screen reader can still read the text, at least. So it's not as bad as if it just wasn't there. But you can still add other alternate text. The goal is to really be as descriptive as possible. It's really hard to get around a website with just a screen reader if you don't have really descriptive tags. So if this was on a website, let's say H&R Block or TurboTax, and I'm on my last screen and I'm about to submit my tax data, I might actually tell them what's about to happen instead of just submit form. That way they know, and maybe they think to themselves, okay, I better double check, or nope, this is great, go ahead and submit my tax data. So writing alternate text, it is kind of a big endeavor. We do have a lot of images and a lot of buttons on websites. So I wouldn't necessarily get overwhelmed and immediately think you have to write alternate information for everything. Pick an important page, like the home page or a category page, and then just one by one start adding some of this alternate tags. Depending on how your content is produced will depend on where you put that alternate tag. So the second thing I want to talk about is color blindness. So there's quite a few different kinds of color blindness, but the most common ones in the United States are yellow, blue, and red, green. About 8% of men and about 0.1% of women have some sort of color blindness. Now, if we look at this image of apples, you can see that the yellow-blue color blindness, apart from the stems and the leaves, there's not really a strong difference. But look at how different it is when you have red-green color blindness. If I go through and I actually apply that to a form, this middle form, if I'm just using red and green to try and validate, and somebody has red-green color blindness, or in this case, deuteranopia, they would have no idea what was wrong and what was not correct, like what was correct. So in this case, you would have to redesign this in some sort of way. You'd include an error message or some icons, or maybe just completely different colors. So similarly to alt tags, it's not that you necessarily have to go run out and completely make sure everything is colorblind right away. Just look for important parts that you need to start validating. We use red and green so frequently on forms that if you're looking for a good place to start, I would start there. At the end of this deck, there's a lot of different tools listed. And so how I did these, with the apples and with these forms, that's one of the tools listed in the back. So if you're thinking, I have no idea how to do this, don't worry, I have a ton of different resources for you. We'll kind of very quickly go through those, and then they're all linked so you can go through them on your own. So unfortunately, I was thinking about that actually when we were talking about doing this as a webinar. Right now, if I didn't provide the slides, somebody would have no way of listening. So that's one of the reasons why I tried to make sure to highlight as much of this as I could on the slides, because then that way somebody who is deaf could still sort of follow along. In the case of video and audio captioning, it's really important that you either provide some sort of transcript or an alternate way to get that information. If you're really excited about something and you record a video, but there's no text equivalent, people who are deaf are not going to be able to access that. Where I see this a lot is training videos. So let's say you released a brand new website and you're going to record some screen sharing and some videos to help people, learn how to navigate the new website. Well, if you don't have a text equivalent, again, people who are deaf really aren't going to be able to perceive them. Sort of the interesting part here that a lot of people don't think about. It's helpful to also include visual changes for your video. So let's say you're providing a transcript and there are two people talking and one person gets up and walks out of the room. Actually taking the time to include that visual depiction is really helpful for people who might not be able to visually see it follow along. So it's not just the actual words and what people are saying, but it's also the description as well. So again, we had perceivable as our first part. The second part is operable. And so again, in perceivable, I had to actually be able to see it or hear it with my senses. In operable, I must be able to use it. So it's not just enough that I can see it, I have to actually do something with it. Where this commonly comes into play are all of the devices outside of a mouse and keyboard. So when designing or developing or working on content for our website, a lot of times we think about a mouse and a keyboard. But not everybody uses a mouse. Not everybody even uses a keyboard, or they might use a keyboard with their phone. If I'm somebody with Parkinson's, having a keyboard for my phone can be really helpful, because if I'm having a particularly bad day with some tremors, it might be really hard to click on that button. By using a keyboard, I can, have something a little bit steadier to help me. So similarly to getting started with perceivable, here are the two sort of tips that you can get started with operable. The first one is pretty straightforward. After this, I want you to go find your library's website, or even just try with any other website, and try to get around and do something with just a keyboard. You'd be surprised at how hard it is on most websites. Almost every single website is designed for a keyboard and a mouse. And again, unfortunately, there are plenty of people who that just does not work for. keyboards in general, they aren't just for desktops either. Again, there might be somebody who is really using it on an iPad or an Android tablet or a mobile phone, and they might use a keyboard as well. But at a minimum, I would say at least try your website with just the keyboard. You can see in this example, I'm going through on Twitter and just using a keyboard. This is actually something that Twitter had to fix. Originally, there wasn't a way to keyboard over to the close sign. So if a keyboard user opened it and tried to compose a new tweet, the only way to actually get out of this screen here was to write a tweet. And then you could click tweet and then it would close out. And then you have to go back and you delete it. So thankfully, a couple years ago, they made sure that that close button, that exit on the top right, was keyboard accessible. So I did not include an example for flashing elements on purpose, but because anything that flashes or is really shaky movement, it can cause somebody with epilepsy to experience seizures. It can be really bad for people with vestibular disorders. So that's things like people who get vertigo really quickly. So anytime there's something that auto plays or auto scrolls, like a carousel slider, that can cause issues for people. That's not to say that you can't incorporate some movement. Just make sure that there's not a ton of flashing to it. And if possible, you disable autoplay on videos. All right, our third one, again, we had perceivable, they have to see it. We had operable, they have to be able to use it. And this next one is understandable. They have to actually be able to understand what it is. So specifically, there's two parts here. They have to be able to understand the content, and they actually have to understand how to use your website. So the two sort of main components here, you know, if you design for something that has a really high reading comprehension level, you use really complex sentences and conjugation and all of these other sort of literacy flourishes, it can be hard for people to read. The same thing goes if you have a very complex language. It's not as much of an issue in you know, library systems, but definitely some fields like financial or you know, anything legal, they use a ton of jargon. You know, if you've ever had that, you know, you open a new program or something for the first time and it has this giant thing that it wants you to read of terms and conditions. It's like 30 pages long, and you try and read it, but it's all in legalese. This would definitely not qualify for understandable. Those are very hard to read. So there's three things I want to talk here. The first one is using just simple, concise language. We're going to explain jargon, and then I want to talk about breaking up content with headers and white space. So again, simple, concise language, very plain language. It's not that everything has to be at a first grade reading level with very short sentences, but it can be helpful to sort of break up your sentences into meaningful segments. You know, whenever possible, you want to really focus on words or content that feels relevant to the user, something that's familiar, and shorter words over longer words. It's not that you can never use them, but if every word is really abstracted, they're all very long, they're sort of far-fetched, it gets very hard to read very quickly. You'll also see this in just sort of eliminating redundancy. So in this example on the left, it's still plain language, it's still simple language, but just a lot of extra. Somebody already struggles with reading comprehension, this can seem overwhelming because that's a lot of words. Instead, they created a much more streamlined one with just smaller, very short labels that is a lot easier for your people to read. Again, it's not necessarily that everybody needs very simple language, but I think all of us can appreciate the fact that the one on the right is much, much easier. So here's kind of a silly example. These both say the same thing. I could go through this whole paragraph about this concept, or just very simply, more night jobs would keep more youths off the streets. There's a lot of different resources around writing simple, concise language. I suspect a lot of our attendees today have already started writing or have been writing with concise language for years. But again, I'll have some resources for you there as well. So jargon's kind of an interesting one. We won't end up in an area where you will have a ton of legalese, I suspect, but there's still a lot of extra words that can be confusing for people. So if you do end up having a lot of very complex terminology, I'd recommend including a glossary, definitions, or a tooltip, or something that helps users sort of figure out what that term means. You can see an example here where, again, they're just trying to use jargon, or sorry, not use jargon, and sort of keep it just very familiar. This is an example from a app where you can go through and buy, rent, or sell your house. But looking at the left one, migrate and fly. These still qualify as jargon because they're sort of using cutesy terms for each of these. So if you just look at the left one and you're trying to figure out which of these means buy, rent, or sell, I would have no idea. I guess I could probably figure out that fly means sell, or maybe migrate, or maybe the point here is that it doesn't have to be a hard, complex term to be jargon. Just use words that are familiar. And then the last one under operable is to break up content with space. So I've been doing that throughout this. You'll notice there's a lot of white space, concepts are separated appropriately, headers are a lot darker or bolder to try and break up content appropriately. So here's an example from a website called plainlanguage.gov. And while I believe nobody on this call would qualify for anything that on plainlanguage.gov, there's not a legal requirement. It's still one of my favorite websites for really great examples of how you can write concise language. So here's a great one about just splitting up dense paragraphs. It's actually the same amount of text, but just including that extra little bit of white space and some bolding makes a huge difference. Even if you don't read either of them, the one on the left actually looks kind of overwhelming, whereas the one on the right looks a lot less overwhelming. All right, and then the last of our four is that content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents. It's kind of a mouthful. So basically what this means is that your website shouldn't break. It should be reliable enough that if a new phone comes out or a new tablet comes out or any other future technology, it's probably not going to break. So there's some pretty simple ways that you can accomplish this. Going through and making sure it works in browsers, that your website doesn't have any big errors, there's no pages that break, it works on a mobile phone. Just basic code practices there will really help. So the two I want to talk about here under getting started are mobile responsiveness and screen reader demos. So at this point, if your website is not mobile responsive, it absolutely needs to be. This isn't necessarily an accessibility guideline, it's a general usability thing. More people access websites via mobile devices than they do via desktops. If you think about the different communities that could use your library services, there's a lot of communities that, a mobile device might be their primary device for accessing the internet. Not everybody has internet at home. And if your website doesn't work with a mobile device, they can't access your library services. So I'm not going to play these screen reader demos just because playing a video over Zoom gets a little laggy. But there are three main screen readers. The first one is called JAWS, and it's been around for the longest. Then MacBooks, so the Apple laptops have their own screen reader built in. And then finally, there's a free one called NVDA. So this last one, NVDA, is the one that's sort of increasing in popularity because it works on both Windows and Macs, and it's free. JAWS is really, really fully featured, but it's also $900. And most people, that can be a very, very steep purchase price. So go through and at least watch one of these on your own. It's really, really interesting to see how many things you can do with a screen reader. We actually can hear a lot faster than we can read. So when you hear how fast some of these screen readers are going, I mean, they have these cranked up to almost 400 words a minute and can still successfully use websites. So just kind of a recap of these getting started. I won't read all of them, but again, we had our perceivable, people can actually sense it. We had our operable, they can use it. We had understandable, they know what's going on in your content and the website. We had robust, which is just that your website's not going to break and I can use it on various devices. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes going through some tools and resources, and then if we have any questions, I'd love to answer them. If you haven't had a chance to type in your question, feel free to do so now or just after we get through the tools and resources. So I broke resources into 4 groups: our perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So I use this color blindness simulator to go through and actually create the demonstrations that you saw earlier in this webinar. If you want more information about creating a perceivable site, I also have a really, really well-written article for that as well. For operable, again, I didn't want to necessarily show anything flashing. I didn't want to be the one who accidentally caused somebody's seizure. But if you do want some examples, I would recommend going to this epilepsy analysis tool. It'll actually analyze a website or a piece of content for you, but it'll also give you some demos. The understandable, I've got the link to that plain language guidelines here. Again, it's a government website, but it's the rare government website that's actually incredibly well designed, and they use plain language throughout their website. Robust, there's these 3 different main types of screen readers. If you would like a good article about how somebody who doesn't normally use a screen reader and their experience with it, I'd highly recommend the Smashing Magazine article. And then just a couple of different articles and books if you would like any further resources. I am going to see if there's any questions. All right, I don't see any in the chat. Feel free to type some now or raise your hand if you do have any questions. So I'll go back and present this again. Just so you know, these slides will be available after. So then that way you don't have to sort of jot down everything quickly. I believe these will be posted on the WiLSWorld website. Jeff, is that correct?
Yeah, we'll attach, I think it will be attached to the website for, we have a page for this session. So we'll do that. I think we would also send a link to the slides out with the recording, which will go out to everybody that registered for today.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I don't know if you have any other questions. Well, thank you so much for coming today and presenting for us, Ashley. Fascinating topic, always important, and it's always on the top of the list of kind of issues that we need to be tackling now, not just in the library world, but all over the place, of course.
Yeah, so there was a question if we can share the link with coworkers. Please do. Please share this link with every single person. I think it's really important that more people start talking and thinking about accessibility There's nothing in here that's proprietary, so feel free to take it, rip it apart, grab links, whatever is going to be most helpful for you to start really thinking about and start implementing some of these suggestions.
Fantastic. All right, thank you so much. I think, boy, this is the point at which I should know if we have another WiLSWorld Shorts coming up later this year, but I don't know that. Andy, are you still on the line? Could you jump in if there's something else we wanted to promote before we wrap up for today?
We don't have another one on the books yet, but we are putting together the rest of them for the year. So there should be 3 more, and we will share information about that as soon as we've got it.
Dynamite. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for attending. I hope you got as much out of the session as I did. And thank you again to Ashley for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Have a great day and a good afternoon, everyone. Stay healthy.